The moment the Chabahar control tower collapsed, somewhere in London, a shipping insurer quietly opened a spreadsheet and adjusted a war risk premium. That adjustment, invisible, unannounced, executed by an actuary rather than a general, is the most honest available indicator of what just happened strategically in the Persian Gulf. You can deny military losses in a state broadcast. You can tell the Iranian population that IRGC forces successfully struck 8 bases across the region. You cannot deny commercial insurers repricing maritime risk in real time. You cannot deny cargo and tanker traffic that normally queues near Chabahar, rerouting hundreds of miles out of their way rather than sit near a target zone. You cannot deny the satellite imagery that anyone in the world can pull up and compare to last month's photograph of the same coordinates, showing crater patterns consistent with penetrator munitions where a functioning control tower used to be. Iran's strategic loss over the last 72 hours is not primarily measurable in target count. It is measurable in the repriced insurance premium, the rerouted tanker, and the crude oil tick that registered in trading markets within hours of the strikes, even though no tanker traffic through the strait itself has actually been blocked. The economic bleeding is harder to hide than the military bleeding, and it probably hurts the regime more in the long run. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why these particular targets, a port control tower, a rail bridge, a series of railway spans on a corridor connecting Iran to China and Russia, represent something categorically different from every previous exchange in this conflict, you need to understand the strategic theory that has been governing Iranian behavior for the entire duration of the confrontation, and why the 72-hour strike sequence just destroyed the physical infrastructure on which that theory depended. Iran's war strategy has rested on 3 structural pillars. Not 3 tactical advantages, not 3 military capabilities. 3 structural pillars whose simultaneous existence was required for the regime's theory of the conflict to remain viable. The first pillar was control over the Strait of Hormuz, not necessarily the ability to close it completely. Even Iran's military planners understood that closing the strait permanently against a committed American naval response was beyond the IRGC's demonstrated capability. The threat of disruption was the instrument, the ability to make commercial traffic so hazardous, insurance premiums so elevated, and shipping company risk calculations so unfavorable that the global economic cost of the confrontation would eventually compel Washington to offer terms that preserve the regime's core interests. The strait was the loaded gun pointed at the global oil market. It did not need to fire to influence every negotiating calculation in the room. The second pillar was Chabahar, Iran's deepwater port on the Indian Ocean coast, positioned specifically outside the Strait of Hormuz, was the economic bypass that made the strait leverage survivable from the Iranian side. Even if American naval pressure constrained strait transit, Chabahar remained open. Oil and trade that could not move through the Gulf could move through the Indian Ocean. Revenue that Western sanctions were designed to eliminate could arrive through the back door. The regime could remain financially functional. IRGC payrolls current, militia networks funded, subsidy systems operational at minimum thresholds. Because Chabahar was the valve that stayed open regardless of what happened at the strait. Not incidentally, the Chabahar control tower served the military mission as well. The same technology that nominally managed vessel navigation was being used to track and designate targets for IRGC drone and missile attacks against commercial shipping transiting the strait approaches. The tower was simultaneously an economic lifeline and a targeting node. Its destruction was simultaneously an economic strike and a military one. The third pillar was the Eastern Rail Corridor, the railway running from Tehran northeast toward Mashhad, and then outward through Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan to the broader Eurasian supply network connecting Iran to China and Russia. On that corridor moved everything the IRGC needed but could not procure through Western-controlled financial systems. Military components from Russian defense enterprises, industrial equipment from Chinese state manufacturers, sanctioned technology moving through channels that enforcement mechanisms structurally struggled to monitor. The rail corridor was the physical thread connecting Iranian military capacity to the 2 external powers whose strategic interest in Iran's survival made them willing to sustain it despite Western pressure. As long as the trains ran, Iran was not fully isolated regardless of what the sanctions architecture was designed to achieve. In a single 48-hour strike package, the United States military kicked out all 3 legs of that stool. Chabahar is rubble. The railway bridge in northeastern Iran is a collapsed span in a dry riverbed, tracks bent upward toward nothing. And the IRGC, in one of the most analytically significant admissions in the conflict, confirmed that 2 additional bridges on the route toward Mashhad were struck. The IRGC almost never confirms operational losses unless the damage is too obvious to deny. Satellite imagery exists. Independent journalists can reach these locations. Passenger rail between Tehran and Mashhad has been suspended, which is a fact visible to every Iranian who is going to ride that train. The confirmation was compelled by the undeniable, and what it compels the confirmation of is not just the loss of infrastructure, it is the loss of the supply route through which the IRGC was receiving what it needed from Russia and China while every other supply channel was under pressure. Nothing is rolling in anymore on that corridor. The trains that were quietly receiving Russian military components, labeled as agricultural equipment, and Chinese industrial materials marked as consumer goods are not running. The IRGC is now supplying its operations from whatever is already inside the country, with no reliable resupply pathway. The timing of the 3 simultaneous strikes, all 3 pillars, hit within the same 48-hour window rather than sequentially, was the most important operational decision in the entire sequence, and it has received almost no analytical attention in coverage focused on the dramatic footage of individual explosions. Sequential strikes against 3 different strategic targets give the adversary time to react between strikes. After the first target is hit, the regime rewrotes economic activity around it, adjusts logistics planning, reinforces alternate pathways, and prepares political and operational responses for the next strike before it arrives. Simultaneous strikes against all 3 targets deny the adaptation window. You cannot reroute around Chabahar while Chabahar is going down if the rail corridor is going down at the same moment. You cannot shift supply chains to alternate pathways if all the alternate pathways are being struck in the same operational window. The simultaneous targeting of all 3 pillars was specifically designed to prevent the regime from trading one capability for another in the brief interval between strikes. It lost all 3 before it could save any of them. Now let us understand the strike architecture that made simultaneous targets across Iran's maritime southern coast, its northeastern interior, and its eastern rail connections, all achievable in a single coordinated operational window. Because the layered multi-platform sequence that CENTCOM executed is as strategically revealing as the targets themselves, the F-16CJ Wild Weasel goes in first. Its entire operational purpose is suppression of enemy air defenses, hunting the radar sites and surface-to-air missile batteries that protect everything else with AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles that home in on the electromagnetic emissions of active radar systems. The logic of the harm is elegantly brutal. The moment an Iranian radar operator activates his system to search for the incoming package, the radar's own emissions become the guidance signal for a missile that is already in the air looking for exactly that frequency. The Iranian operator faces an impossible choice. Turn on the radar to try to see what is coming and die. Keep the radar dark to avoid the harm and be blind while the strike package proceeds uncontested. This dilemma has governed CAD doctrine since the first generation of anti-radiation weapons, and the Wild Weasel's systematic execution of it against the Iranian coastal air defense architecture is why the main package that follows operates in a progressively clearer threat environment with each subsequent night of strikes. Behind the Wild Weasels come the F-15E Strike Eagles, which carry 2 classes of weapons relevant to the targets being struck. The AGM-158B Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile in its extended range configuration allows the F-15E to release the weapon from well outside the engagement envelope of whatever Iranian air defense system survived the Wild Weasel suppression pass, and the missile navigates autonomously to its designated aim point using GPS, terrain matching, and terminal electro-optical guidance. No radar lock required from the delivery aircraft after release. No continued exposure to the threat ring that the released weapon is flying into. The F-15E also carries 2,000-pound and 5,000-pound penetrating bombs for targets that require physical structural destruction rather than standoff effect. A control tower whose reinforced concrete construction requires a penetrator to guarantee elimination rather than surface damage. A fortified rail junction whose support spans require calibrated direct delivery rather than area effect. The weapons systems officer in the rear seat is running a targeting pod locked onto coordinates that were confirmed through satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and ISR feeds collected well before the aircraft departed. By the time the crew is over the target, every aim point has been validated multiple times through independent collection methods. The precision is not a feature of the munition. It is a product of the intelligence that precedes the munition. The B-1B Lancer adds the mass standoff component that no other platform in the package can replicate. A single B-1B carries 24 JASSMs per airframe. A 2-ship formation puts 48 precision cruise missiles into a single coordinated strike from a platform that the IRGC's degraded air defense network has essentially no reliable engagement solution against. Naval Tomahawks, launching from surface combatants and submarines in the Arabian Sea, add undersea origin standoff that presents no surface signature to Iranian radar systems. The missiles simply rise from the water and navigate at low altitude on terrain-following routes that exploit the gaps in the Iranian early warning architecture that the Wild Weasel campaign has been systematically opening. F-22s and F-35s running air superiority overhead ensure that the Iranian Air Force, whatever it has left that is functional and willing to engage, cannot contest the strike package's freedom of action in Iranian airspace. F-18 Super Hornets off the Abraham Lincoln add the naval aviation component that the carrier provides with its continuous sortie cycle, maintaining persistent strike capacity across the operational window. All of it synchronized across a combat radius approaching 800 nautical miles. All of it sequenced so that by the time Iranian defenders understand what is happening, the first targets are already destroyed, and the next wave is inbound from a different direction. What Iran threw back against this package reveals the true state of its military position in a way that its public statements were specifically designed to obscure. The Shahab-3, Iran's solid-fuel intermediate-range ballistic missile with a stated range approaching 1,000 miles, has been the IRGC's primary retaliatory instrument. 10 Shahab-3s were fired at the coalition airbase in Jordan. The first launches, aimed at Jordan since the previous month. Every single one was intercepted. The IRGC publicly claimed it struck 8 separate bases across the region. Technically, it launched at 8 bases. Whether anything landed is a different question, and the intercept record provides a comprehensive answer. Patriot batteries and the layered air defense architecture that integrates across American and Allied platforms are doing exactly what they were designed to do, and the IRGC's own commanders understand this. You do not keep firing expensive, hard-to-replace ballistic missiles at defended bases if the missiles are actually achieving the claimed results. You do it because sitting back and doing nothing during a period when your regime just buried its supreme leader and the domestic audience needs to believe you are fighting is politically more dangerous than the operational cost of the futile launches. The Shahab-3 salvos are not a military instrument at this point. They are a domestic communications product that consumes finite, irreplaceable inventory to produce the appearance of retaliation for an audience that cannot independently verify whether anything actually hit. The one-way attack drone campaigns have been supplementing the ballistic missile launches, hoping that volume overcomes the precision of the interceptors, where ballistic missiles are being defeated. A handful have found gaps in coverage. Most have not come close. The gap this reveals is the most honest available measurement of where the IRGC's offensive capacity stands after the systematic degradation of its communications infrastructure, its targeting networks, and its launch coordination architecture. A Shahed drone launched without a coherent targeting picture is a one-way projectile hoping for luck. The IRGC's communications strikes have left many of its launch operators with degraded situational awareness about what they are actually firing at and whether the target is worth the expenditure. The drones keep flying because the alternative, visible in action, is institutionally unacceptable, not because the launches are tactically rational. Iran's attempts to spin this operational picture domestically reveal the internal information problem that the three-reason analysis of why Tehran has not come to the table requires understanding fully. The first reason is structural. De-escalating now looks like surrender, and surrender threatens the regime's survival more than continued military losses do. The regime's legitimacy, particularly with the hardline factions calling the MOU framework treason, depends on the narrative that it is holding its ground against American aggression. A ceasefire that acknowledges the loss of Chabahar, the severed rail corridor, and the suspended Tehran-Mashhad passenger service would require admitting publicly what the satellite imagery already confirms, that the 3 legs of the strategic stool have been kicked out. The political cost of that admission inside the Iranian power structure may exceed the military cost of continuing to absorb the strikes. The second reason is strategic. The regime is betting that Russia or China will intervene diplomatically on its behalf before the military degradation reaches a threshold from which recovery is impossible. Both China and Russia have significant economic interests in the conflict's resolution, and the regime's calculation is that those interests will eventually translate into diplomatic pressure that gives Tehran a negotiating outcome better than unconditional capitulation. The third reason is internal information failure. Some factions inside the regime may genuinely not have accurate information about how bad the damage actually is, because admitting losses internally carries its own political risk inside a system where conveying bad news to superiors has historically been associated with personal consequences. A system in which the commanders on the ground know the damage is catastrophic, but the officials at the top are receiving filtered reports that minimize those losses, is a system in which the political decisions being made about negotiations are being made against an inaccurate picture of the military situation. The regime may be betting that it can hold out longer than is actually possible because it does not fully know how much it has already lost. The Air Force One detail from this period is analytically significant precisely because of its institutional meaning rather than its dramatic value. Iran issued threats against the president's aircraft directly and publicly through official channels. The Secret Service responded by placing President Trump on the older VC-25A, the baby blue Boeing that has accumulated decades of operational testing hardening upgrades, countermeasures development, and real-world validation through every threat environment American presidents have faced across its service life, rather than the newer Qatari-gifted aircraft that has not yet completed the hardening and operational validation cycle that the older platform has accumulated. This decision communicates something specific to the Iranian government. The threat was registered, assessed, and answered with the most proven protective instrument available rather than the most impressive-looking one. The older VC-25A in the air, carrying the American president, after Iran publicly declared its intent to shoot it down, is the Secret Service's operational judgment that Iranian capabilities do not currently include the reliable ability to defeat the countermeasures on that specific platform. It is not a retreat. It is a capability assessment expressed as a protective decision. The commercial satellite confirmation of Chabahar's destruction is the element of this situation that the regime's domestic communications apparatus cannot manage, and its inability to manage it is itself strategically revealing. In previous conflicts involving authoritarian states, the government controlled the information about battlefield losses because it controlled the media and the communications infrastructure through which citizens received information. The satellite imagery available in the current era eliminates that control for sufficiently large and physically obvious targets. The Chabahar control tower is large and physically obvious. Its before and after satellite comparison is accessible to anyone with an internet connection and the ability to use a browser. The Iranian government cannot tell its population that the control tower is intact when the satellite image shows a crater. It cannot claim that Chabahar is operating normally when independent ship tracking data shows commercial vessels rerouting hundreds of miles to avoid the port zone. The regime can deny military outcomes that happened in the desert at night at coordinates that civilians cannot access. It cannot deny outcomes that are visible from orbit and confirmed by commercial maritime traffic behavior. The economic signals, the insurance premium adjustments, the crude oil price tick, the rerouted tankers, are the financial system pricing in what the satellite images confirm. The financial system is not subject to Iranian state media management. It operates on the same satellite imagery and ship tracking data that any analyst can access, and it is updating in real time on the basis of what that data shows rather than what Tehran claims. The honest strategic question that the 72-hour strike sequence raises but does not yet answer is the one that the final analytical frame of the current campaign must sit with. The three-legged stool is destroyed. The regime has lost the port, the rail corridor, and the strait leverage simultaneously. The economic bleeding is visible in insurance markets and tracking databases and crude pricing, and the rerouted tankers that will not approach Chabahar until someone rebuilds what the penetrating munitions destroyed. The regime's options for sustaining the conflict operationally are narrowing. The question is whether the next target category, power generation and refining capacity rather than logistics and communications, signals the shift from a campaign designed to degrade Iran's ability to conduct military operations to a campaign designed to unwind the regime's ability to function as a state. Those are two fundamentally different military objectives, and the choice between them will determine what this conflict ultimately produces. A degraded but surviving regime reconstitutes over time in ways that eventually recreate the strategic problem. A regime whose ability to function as a state has been systematically dismantled, whose power generation fails, whose refining capacity burns, whose population loses access to the basic infrastructure that the government's legitimacy depends on maintaining, faces a different kind of internal pressure than military setbacks alone can generate. The strikes on Chabahar and the railway bridges destroyed the regime's external supply and revenue architecture. The strikes on power generation that some analysts assess as the next target category would destroy the regime's internal social contract architecture. That is a different war than the one that most people discussing this conflict believe they are watching. Watch the next targets closely. If the strikes move inland toward remaining power generation and refining capacity, rather than continuing to work the coastal and transport logistics infrastructure, it is confirmation that the operational objective has shifted in exactly the way that changes the answer to the question of what this campaign ends. The port is in rubble. The railway bridge is a collapsed span in a dry riverbed. The insurance premium has been adjusted in London. And a regime running out of legs to stand on is calculating whether the pain of continued military losses is more manageable than the political cost of the negotiated outcome whose possibility the last 72 hours have both created and defined.